While atheists often view themselves as champions of reason, reason is one of the most inescapable problems for atheism. Unfortunately, atheists usually don't realize it because they haven't followed their beliefs through to the obvious conclusion.
And what beliefs are these? The label atheist means nothing beyond the fact that I do not believe in a god or deity, or more precisely, I lack the theistic belief, which of course is said belief in God. This in itself has no implication at all, especially in a reality where no God has been proven to exist, let alone be fundamental for any quality of reality. You'd have to first prove God exists to prove that he is necessary for something. You could say that we're missing a mechanism in something unexplained, but then you can't, give that mechanism arbitrary qualities based upon your own presuppositions. You've certainly caught my attention, and I am intrigued. Oh, and not all atheists view themselves as bastions of reason. Many of us just view ourselves as having fallen victim to one less unjustified belief than most, taking an absence of theistic belief 100% of the way.
Human beings tend to trust our cognitive faculties, which is simply a fancy term for the processes and abilities we use to form our beliefs. These processes and abilities include things like memory, moral judgment, reason, and so on. Of course, we understand that our cognitive faculties aren't perfect. We understand, for instance, that our memories are incomplete and sometimes wrong. Nevertheless, we assume that if we carefully think through a problem, we can get to the truth.
No, some questions will ultimately remain unanswered in all probability. However, through a collective effort of collaboration of thought set to rigid and pragmatic methodology, we hope to decrease this ignorance as much as possible. Being reasonable is to do with how you deal with what you have the capacity to do so, whilst also understanding your individual and even collective limits. One aspect of this is the notion of fallibility, i.e. the understanding that I as a person could be wrong and thus should listen to my opposition. This does not then mean I should merely accept everything that the opposition says because I could be wrong, but rather that I should test what they say against a background of peers also knowledgeable in said field, whilst discarding of the fallacies presented.
So the general reliability of our cognitive faculties is something we take for granted. However, when we adopt a belief that undermines this general reliability, we're no longer justified in believing that our cognitive faculties are generally reliable. If, for example, I come to believe that a mad scientist has put a chip in my brain that controls my memories, I'm no longer justified in trusting my memories.
A reasonable way to reduce the possibility of this would be to cross-confer with others, as they would not have this inability, if it were the case that you did. You could get them to check for such a chip, i.e. test the claim. They could also give you constant reassurance of your memory's capabilities. The person may still be cautious, as a person with Alzheimer's should, but that does not stop them functioning. Now, it is possible that these other people also have the same chip implant, yet then we enter the realm of probability versus possibility, i.e. discussion on what resources and technology a person would need to carry out such an operation, what sort of power it takes. This analogy only functions in absolute isolation, which philosophy and science are not.
If I become convinced that a psychiatrist has spent years hypnotizing me and manipulating my moral judgments, I'm no longer justified in trusting my moral judgments.
Well, the simple thing there would be to confer with others once again. No person has absolute authority when it comes to morality. If that were the case, the world would be such a ghastly place as only one monster needed be in place to ruin the lives of countless others. In a modern functioning society, ethics are discussed. This filters out anomalies such as individuals with sociopathic tendencies. Again, it's not a big issue, as you may think, as there are actual cases like this, yet people don't stop functioning completely. They are at higher risk of problems, but they are not merely junk, they are still human beings. returning back to what I said about one person controlling everything, I mean, could you imagine that world? It would be a world where a monster only had to say that slavery was okay and it would be okay, where they could say, being gay was wrong and it would be wrong, and they could say, when you slaughter a nation, you can take all the virgin girls and rape them and make them your wives after you've butchered their families right before their eyes, and you just slaughtered their prisoner brothers as well. I mean, what kind of monster would worship such a ideology?
Atheism is one of the beliefs that undermine the general reliability of our cognitive faculties.
How? How so? There being no God has zero impact upon the idea of reason. Why? Because unlike a brain having been connected to memory and morality, God is in no way being connected to reason at all. I mean, you first have to show that God existed like the brain existed. Therefore, this argument does not follow, and I hope you sort that out straight away.
Here I mean atheism in the strong sense of naturalism, the view that the natural world is all that exists. In a softer sense, an atheist could simply reject the God of traditional theism while believing in some lesser deity.
No. Any deity is instantly excluded, even if it were, as you term it, a lesser deity. What you mean is merely a non-naturalistic force that does not meet the definition of a deity at the same time, because it's not a case of deity, naturalistic force. They're not the same thing. Whole Jediism and midichlorians and all that, because Jedis do actually exist in the real world. People actually do believe that thing, and there are the Jedi churches, and they are a bona fide religion. And yes, you could see them as an atheistic religion. And then take, for example, Buddhism. You have sort of three layers. You have the, more theistic sort of layer, which does view Buddha as some sort of divine being. Then you have the layer which thinks Buddha was a spiritual, and there is a spiritual realm, but again, it's not a deity, he's not a divine being, etc. He's just connected to this non-naturalistic world. And then we have the more philosophical basis, which is purely, okay, Buddha isn't divine, there's no spiritual world, but the teachings are good, etc. It's a good philosophy. So you have these three different layers. Now, you're claiming that instantly the middle layer is, it's just excluded, when actually it does exist. And again, I gave you two examples there, mid-Buddhism and also Jediism. If you're going to talk about something, you may actually want to know what it is, as though it's not a major part of your argument, it does lead to you looking intellectually weaker.
But most people who call themselves atheists don't mean that they reject one particular god. They mean that they reject all gods and anything supernatural, leaving them with the natural world. It's this strong sense of atheism, naturalism, which undermines the reliability of our cognitive faculties. To understand why, let's consider a few remarks by some of the great minds of the past. In the first of his Meditations on First Philosophy, French philosopher and mathematician René Descartes is deliberately undermining the reliability of his cognitive faculties, because he wants to know if there's anything that can't possibly be doubted, no matter how defective our faculties are. Descartes says that an omnipotent deity, if he wanted to, could deceive us all the time. But then Descartes anticipates an objection. What if an atheist says, I don't believe in God or demons, so there's no powerful being that could be deceiving me? Descartes quickly dismisses the atheist by insisting that the weaker the cause, the weaker the effect. He writes, perhaps there may be some who would prefer to deny the existence of so powerful a God rather than believe that everything else is uncertain. Let us not argue with them, but grant them that everything said about God is a fiction. According to their supposition, then, I have arrived at my present state by fate, or chance, or a continuous chain of events, or by some other means. Yet since deception and error seem to be imperfections, the less powerful they make my original cause, the more likely it is that I am so imperfect as to be deceived all the time.
Not at all. This presupposes that a deity would want to make us perfect, or could make us perfect. Now, if we utilize the scripture of the Bible, we see rather simply that one of these is false, as in, Genesis, we have the account of the fall of man. Now, either God, according to Scripture, failed to create man perfect due to some inability, or did not wish to do so due to some personality trait they have. René's own argument digests the Abrahamic perspective, as the Scripture itself states that said humankind, and thus its deity, is anything but perfect. With random process, I at least have a chance. You, meanwhile, have none, and therefore this argument is self-contradictory.
In other words, if my cognitive faculties are the result of natural processes, I clearly can't say that they were intended to get me to the truth. So what kind of confidence can I have that my reason isn't constantly leading me astray? The Scottish philosopher David Hume has a partial response. According to Hume, we can keep our reasoning well grounded by limiting it to everyday affairs where our experiences serve as a constant check on our reasoning. But this means that we should recognize our limitations and avoid reasoning about matters that go beyond our experience. Hume says, "The imagination of man is naturally sublime, delighted with whatever is remote and extraordinary, and running, without control, into the most distant parts of space and time in order to avoid the objects which custom has rendered too familiar to it. A correct judgment observes a contrary method, and avoiding all distant and high enquiries, confines itself to common life, and to such objects as fall under daily practice and experience, leaving the more sublime topics to the embellishment of poets and orators, or to the arts of priests and politicians." Since the claim that God doesn't exist or that the natural world is all that exists are paradigm examples of claims that go far beyond our daily experience, the only reasoning we should employ on such topics is attempting to show people that they don't really know what they're talking about. Hume did precisely this against theism in his dialogues concerning natural religion, but it's important to note that he would have taken a similar stance against naturalism. Human reason, according to Hume, just isn't equipped for such matters and should therefore remain silent on them.
Taking into note the fact that the writings of Hume are over 2 centuries old and therefore a little outdated, as well as they don't speak for all naturalists, maybe we should consider what has been stated as your counter-argument following, as it's been stated by someone currently here and now. When discussing daily experience, this seems a rather restrictive notion of the observable. Now, if I were to simply replace that with all observation, which I can supply evidence for through our daily experience, I can go and cite statistics that demonstrate that germs cause disease. I can show you decay rates to show that nuclear materials decay, and I can also show you genetics to prove that biological organisms evolve over time. Thanks to modern science, our idea of what we can experience in day-to-day life has changed drastically. Now, leading on from this, we come to your further fallacy. If we stick to what we can observe, then at the current, naturalism is the only viable conclusion. Note, conclusion, not presupposition, as we have yet to observe the supernatural. If the supernatural were to become part of the daily experience as the natural is, then this would change and you'd have a compatibilist sort of perspective where natural and supernatural work in unison. But this is not the case, ergo only the natural is experienced daily. And here comes the crux of your issue. The supernatural can be defined in various ways, and yet typically it is defined in a way that is difficult, if not impossible, to demonstrate, and thus not part of our daily experience. As for the absence of theism, if theism is not to be held, then by default a lack of theism, ergo a person should be atheist, is to be held. You've created this rather arbitrary distinction here that atheism should be besides theism, when that does not hold, as atheism is the absence of theism, so if you remove the theism, you have atheism. Simple.
In Part 8 of the Dialogues, Hume presents a simple theory of evolution to account for the appearance of design in nature. But he's almost joking when he offers his theory. It's mainly an attempt to show that all sorts of wild theories might explain order and complexity, so we shouldn't pretend to understand how we got here. A more serious argument for evolution would come along the following century. In 1859, English geologist and natural historian Charles Darwin published his most famous work on the origin of species by means of natural selection or the preservation of favored races and the struggle for life. Darwin argued that within a population of organisms, some organisms will have advantages over others and will therefore be better equipped to survive and reproduce. The offspring of the organisms that survive and reproduce will carry on the advantageous traits, and over a period of many millions of years, we can achieve the biological diversity we see around us.
Give credit where credit is due. That was actually a rather decent description of evolution, given in such a short period. It's nice to actually see that on YouTube compared to what I typically come across.
Years after he published on the origin of species, Darwin began noticing a problem. If our cognitive faculties are the product of natural selection acting on variations within populations, then our cognitive faculties were selected because they helped our ancestors survive and reproduce. But the kinds of traits that help us survive and reproduce have to do with finding food, finding shelter, and finding a mate. So the abilities we have were selected by the exact same process that gave other animals their abilities. How could such a process give us cognitive faculties that can be trusted with questions of philosophy or theology or ethics? Darwin lamented, "With me the horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of man's mind, which has been derived from the mind of the lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy. Would anyone trust in the convictions of a monkey's mind, if there are any convictions in such a mind?" Our cognitive faculties may be more advanced in certain ways than the cognitive faculties of a monkey, but the mechanisms that produced them are the same in both cases. We wouldn't trust the convictions of a monkey's mind. Why trust our own? Because we're smarter? How much smarter? Enough for us to explain ultimate reality or the origin of the universe or the origin of life? How, in the name of common sense, can we trust our mutant berry-finding ability to do things that go vastly beyond what it was selected to do?
Well, that's the thing. We may never have answered that question, and at the time of David Hume, such individuals could be said to have believed as such. Yet the possibility of failure is not a reason as not to try. Ultimately, we are curious creatures. This has evolved as a survival technique, and through this inquiry, we've gone from discovering fire and inventing agriculture to discovering the effects given off by subatomic particles and inventing devices that allow me to stand right here and reach out to thousands across the world. We are the species that could, not the species that had to. You're talking from this predestination perspective. What you are arguing is an argument from hindsight or subjunctive history. You look at where we are and point to the fact that it could have happened any number of ways. Yet because it happened this one way, it is divine will. It's much the same bias as a gambler when they win. They look at the odds and feel they must spin the wheel again because they're on a winning streak and it's divine will. The same can be argued in reverse. Maybe we could have avoided the Dark Ages if one or two religious leaders had been less aggressive, putting us a couple hundred years forward technologically. Maybe if the various mass extinctions throughout history had not occurred, our place may have been taken by a different life form long before us. And they could also be asking themselves the exact same question. Ultimately, we cannot live in the subjunctive as again, utilizing reason is dealing with what we have and working to overcome our initial limitations. This argument, simply put, is not an argument, but rather a fallacy. Alone, the odds of you existing to ask such a question are immensely staggering. True. But in a universe so vast and immense, the staggering is actually rather mundane.
Putting all this together, we can see why belief in naturalism undermines the cognitive faculties required to affirm naturalism. As Darwin eventually noticed, if our faculties were selected to find food and find a mate, we have no basis for trusting our convictions, And this obviously includes the conviction that the natural world is all that exists. So, if we affirm naturalism, we have to reject naturalism. If naturalists choose to dogmatically cling to naturalism, even though it can't possibly be defended, then taking the advice of Hume, they would do well to limit their reasoning to tasks immediately related to everyday life. And following Descartes, if naturalists aren't happy being so confined by their weak cause, perhaps it's time to believe in a more powerful cause.
What an outstandingly poor video. All this attempts to do is remove any counter-argument which is detrimental to the theistic position. Even if we cannot be sure of our cognitive faculties, does not then mean we should just stop trying. No, all this means is that we should do our best with what we currently have, yet always remain open to newer information. The idea of fallibility understands our limitations fully and overcomes one of them, the one which you raised, reducing what you view as a good argument merely to a null point. I mean, let's simply consider what you are saying. You are saying that we should abandon skeptical inquiry and evidence-based beliefs because if the conclusion they point to is correct, the human mind has its limitations. Beyond playing to consequences, it just doesn't pragmatically stand to scrutiny. Yes, I could be wrong, but that does not mean I have to conclude that I am.